Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to talk with you about my plans for October. My very favorite booktube event, the one that inspired me to join booktube in the first place, is Victober, when many of us focus our reading on literature from the Victorian period. This year's hosts are Katie at Books and Things, Marissa at Blatantly Bookish, Roz at Scallydandling About the Books, and Kate Howe. For many years, I only read Victorian-related books, nothing from any other time or place during this month. And of course, I've always read Victorian books during the rest of the year whenever they struck my fancy. But last year, I found myself traveling with a couple of friends to a cabin that had been in their family for generations in the woods of Maine, quite near Acadia National Park. While I was there, I decided to read a couple of books by authors from Maine, including Sarah Orne Jewett's The Country of Pointed Firs, published at the end of the Victorian period, but in the United States. This year, I'll be spending a week up there again, and I want to read some local literature again, but I'll save that for the end of this video. First, on to Victober. There are 4 main prompts, one from each host. The first prompt I want to respond to is Katie's, to read a novel that plays with form in some way. Perhaps because I am at heart a bit perverse, every time I think about Katie, my mind immediately goes to George Eliot. Now, Katie reads incredibly broadly and incredibly deeply and thoughtfully. She talks excitedly about so many books and authors, but one author she's not crazy about is George Eliot. But thinking about authors who play with form made me think about how Eliot sometimes writes braided stories or twisted stories that tell at least somewhat distinct stories that usually come together, at least in some way, at some point in the novel. Now, multi-part stories aren't that uncommon. I think one of the things that sets Eliot's narrative braidings apart a bit is that the individual sections are sometimes quite long. If you read 200 pages about one set of characters and their adventures, it can be a bit of a shock to switch gears and suddenly be living in the heads of a whole different set of characters. Maybe I'll try to think through that choice of Eliot's as I read this month. At any rate, I'm planning to reread Eliot's Daniel Deronda to meet Katie's prompt, a novel that tells 2 stories that touch at many points, but also which remain quite separate. One of the stories is about Daniel Deronda himself, a young man who was raised by the aristocratic Sir Hugo and then becomes close to Mira Lapido, who introduces him to London's Jewish community. As he becomes more familiar with that community, he's pulled to consider his own faith and identity. His story is twisted together with the story of Gwendolyn Harleth, a young British woman whose family has lost its fortune. She plans to marry a wealthy but cruel man, Grandcourt, partly to ensure that her family does not fall into relative poverty. Interestingly, a whole lot of people, both now and back then, vastly prefer one of the twin plots. In fact, readers felt that way so strongly that some people proposed publishing editions that only had the Gwendolyn bits, and other readers wanted editions with only the Daniel bits. Okay, Marissa gives us a prompt to read a novel that was originally serialized, that is published in parts over time. Daniel Deronda fits this prompt as well. I believe it was published in 8 parts, 1 per month, during the year 1876. I might try to read 1 part at a time, perhaps 1 part per day rather than 1 per month, just to get a little hint of what it would be like to read the novel with a little separation or a little time to think about each specific part, as readers would have when they were each released. The third prompt comes from Kate Howe, to read a Victorian work that touches on the topic of religion. Well, obviously the novel Daniel Deronda does meet this prompt, and I've been thinking about Eliot's novel a lot this year, trying to remember exactly how Eliot portrays not only Judaism, but also the proto-Zionism that emerges as a plot point in the novel. As I've talked about fairly openly here on this channel, I am a very secular person who nevertheless feels deeply connected to Judaism. Eliot is quite sympathetic in her portrayal of Jewish characters and Jewish beliefs, which I might have a few quibbles with, but I remember being intrigued by how different characters consider their own connections to Judaism in different ways, as well as how Eliot writes about the movement that eventually led to the establishment of Israel. A side note for a second. In general, I don't talk about controversial issues much on this channel. I live in D.C. My husband was a relatively high-level government employee for years and years, and many friends are serious politicos with whom I talk politics constantly. But my booktube channel is a bit of a place of respite for me from that world. There is an issue that is very relevant here, and it's one that various people I love very much see in very different ways. For decades, I've spoken against Zionism. Fundamentally, I don't believe in religious states or ethnic states or nationalism. And what has been happening in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon is just devastating. As a person trained as an academic historian, I'm still fascinated with how Zionism developed originally and how it's changed over time. I was surprised but fascinated to see the theme of proto-Zionism when I first read Daniel Deronda, and I was intrigued to see allusions to it in Benjamin Disraeli's novel Tancred, too, which I think I read for my first Victober. So I could read Daniel Deronda to meet all three of these prompts. My goal, though, is actually to read Amy Levy's novel, Reuben Sachs, published in 1888. Like Daniel Deronda, Reuben Sachs explores the complex mix of Jewish identity and English society. Interestingly, Levy wrote this partly in response to what she saw as Eliot's romanticization of Judaism and Jewish culture in Daniel Deronda. Levy was Jewish herself, and while the non-Jewish Eliot studied Jewish thought fairly deeply, she had far less connection to the Jewish community in England. But I'm not certain I'll be able to pick up Reuben Sachs this year. In a recent video, I mentioned that due to some vision issues, I'm relying much more than usual on audiobooks these days, and I don't think I can get access to an audio version of Levy's book. I am really hoping that my doctors and I may have found a bit of a solution, or at least a partial solution, that may allow me to get back to text versions of books. Keep your fingers crossed for me. Well, Daniel Deronda does not meet Roz's prompt to read a play from the Victorian era. I have a few backup ideas, but I've been thinking I'd like to read something from London's Yiddish Theatre scene. Actually, I was hoping there might be a revival production that might have been filmed and available on YouTube. I haven't found one yet from that period, but I did find several documentary-type videos that I might add to my watch list during October. I'm not 100% sure I can find something from the Yiddish Theatre that will actually work for this prompt, but I hope so. In addition to these, I very much want to read two contemporary nonfiction works about the Victorian period. One is Kathryn Hughes' biography of George Eliot. I very much enjoyed it when I first read it, but I'd read almost no Eliot fiction, and I think I would benefit greatly from a reread at this point. And wildly, there's an audiobook version of it in my library's digital catalog, so I will listen to that if I can't read the text version on my shelves. The other nonfiction is one I'm still trying to get through interlibrary loan, with no luck yet. I mentioned it a while ago. The author is Julia Sun-Joo. Under a pen name, she published a romance novel that is sort of a takeoff on Jane Austen. When I found out that she wrote an academic book, I looked it up, and it's a perfect combination for me, the American slave narrative and the Victorian novel. Partly because it's a relatively niche topic published by a university press. The used copies I found online were between $40 for a poor copy and $100 for a better copy. that really isn't in my budget right now. So I'm hoping interlibrary loan comes through for me. Okay, I mentioned that during my travels to Maine, I'd like to read some Maine literature. There's a wonderful independent bookstore in Bar Harbor, fairly near the cabin we'll be staying in, with a great local book section. And I'll be choosing something from there to add to my stack. But for now, my first read will be what seems to be a lesser-known novel by Sarah Orne Jewett called A Marsh Island. There is an old audio version available, but there's also a new reprint published by the University of Pennsylvania Press this past summer. This new edition has an introduction by Don James McLaughlin. I haven't looked at it yet, but from what I hear, the introduction really points to what the scholar refers to as, quote, queer kinship and same-sex domesticity. McLaughlin is, I think, talking about male characters in Jewett's novel. Now, I know that some of you, who will remain nameless, may be rolling your eyes a little about contemporary literary scholars using what is effectively jargon to argue that everything is about queer sexuality. But while I haven't read the intro yet, and I'm hoping that the scholar will not overplay his cards, this book clearly does consider what back in my day we might have called homosocial friendships. And it contains a fairly flamboyant male character who doesn't follow traditional masculine presentation. Perhaps most interestingly to me, Sarah Orne Jewett wrote this novel right after she began to live with Annie Fields, who became her decades-long companion in what came to be known more broadly as a Boston marriage. Typically, we don't know if these relationships were sexual. It isn't hard to argue that many of them were romantic, but what precisely that means in particular circumstances is unclear. Some women in Boston marriages, including Jewett and Fields, exchanged rings and vows that not only proved that they thought of themselves as committed to each other, but also that they chose to show that commitment publicly. At the very least, Boston marriages allowed women to pool their finances and perhaps support themselves without men in charge of their households. At any rate, it isn't surprising to me that Sarah Orne Jewett was thinking about the issue of same-sex domesticity at this particular moment in her life. And let's go back for a minute to Victorian literature, or at least to the author Henry James, an author who is sometimes considered a Victorian. His novel, The Portrait of a Lady, is quite a transatlantic novel that talks about Americans, but also English folks and Italians, etc. I had the very great pleasure of reading that amazing novel with Roz at Scally-Dowling About the Books earlier this year. But I also read a very different novel by Henry James, The Bostonians, partly about, quote, same-sex domesticity, which many people think was inspired by the relationship between Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. I'm afraid I haven't talked about either of these two James novels I read this year on BookTube yet, but I will try to sometime soon. Well, I have a few other possibilities for books I'd like to read this coming month, but I want to see what's possible vision-wise before I make any commitments. My next video will be, I hope, a wrap-up of my reading for the Framed Art Readathon and my related adventures, and I'll try to put that together soon. But I am thrilled that October is here, and I'm very much looking forward to this particular month of bookishness on BookTube and in my life. Thank you all for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.